Hello, hello. Welcome to the webinar we have today. My name is Margaret. I'm the part of the growth team here at Metabase. And today, me and my colleague Jacob Joseph will be talking about data modeling in Metabase. Please let us know in the chat if there is something specific you would like to learn today. We'll try to maybe add it to agenda if we don't cover it already. Feel free to let us know where you're joining from today in the chat. It's always fun to know, how big is our audience and how many countries are present. Before we start, I just want to cover a little bit of the housekeeping rules. If you have any questions, please leave them in the chat. Jacob will pick them up at closer to the end of today's session and answer them live. Our sessions, usually good chance to talk with us, ask questions, and have a real-time response. Also, please answer the polls. You will see the poll running in the right-hand side of your screen. It's also helping us to understand better our audience. And I think that's it. So I'll be happy to give the word to Jacob. Jacob is our success engineer at Metabase. He works with many of our customers. He knows Metabase very well, and he'll be happy to walk you through the data modeling in Metabase today. Welcome, Jacob. And with that, I'm giving you the word.
Awesome. Thanks, Margaret. So today we're going to cover data modeling with Metabase, and I'm going to go ahead and jump in. But yeah, please ask questions in the chat. If I don't see them while I'm talking, or I'll get them at the end. And Margaret will also keep an eye if there's anything like urgent, that kind of thing. Cool. So today we did the introduction. We're going to cover what is data modeling, models as building blocks, data modeling in Metabase, and then best practices for data modeling with Metabase. So data modeling is the storage and transformation of data and metadata, such as data properties, usually relative to a data source and a data target, including description, management, and usage of data and metadata. So I'm going to dig more into that, but just kind of want to start with a definition. So data has two phases: storage, which means keeping data the same in a location, and transformation, which is changing data in some way. The storage phase can be described as persisting or keeping it the same, keeping data the same. And that includes properties like structure, which is if it's rows or columns or multiple dimensions, nested, hierarchical, narrative, unstructured, images, any of that kind of stuff. Semantic definition and reference. So that's what is the data representing? Identity, so how's the data named or referred to as distinct from other data? Taxonomy, how is it classified? Format, how is data expressed? Is it with a comma or a period and a number, things like that? And then relationships, like foreign keys, that kind of thing, if you're familiar with SQL. And then also location. So storage, it has to have a location. So transformation is just changing any of those things. So those are kind of the two main aspects of data modeling. I do need to just touch on metadata quickly, in case anybody's unfamiliar. So metadata is just data about other data. And so Metabase uses metadata quite a lot. That's how we do sort of the magic of making things automatic and connecting two tables based on their relationships and things like that. So common challenges in data modeling are often about a format, a structure based on an intended use. And that really revolves around the data source and whatever the target or targets may be. So, I mean, in some cases, it's, the target is a VP that wants a report in a specific format or a dashboard to look a certain way. In other cases, the target might be some other data system or some other application that needs to consume the data that's been created. So let me touch a little more on that. So like in general, though, the challenges involve one or more of these properties not being what is intended, needed, or expected. There's different methods to data modeling or different approaches. So I've kind of categorized these into query-based and ETL-based. So query-based data modeling is usually based on functionality built into a database or a database client or a database driver, versus ETL-based is usually based on functionality not built into a database or its clients and drivers. This is a little bit different than maybe kind of most common definitions, so I just want to make sure that's clear. The query-based uses both pull and push methods, and then the ETL-based primarily uses push method. So what do I mean by that? The pull method transforms data upon request. So whenever you say, I want to get this data from this table, from this database or whatnot, that's when the data modeling happens if it's query-based. So it's pulling, when it's pulling the data, it's actually changing it, in real time or near real time. And that includes like ad hoc queries. Like if you just write a SQL query, or if you run something in Metabase, that is happening like in near real time. The transformations are happening or changes are happening near real time. But there's also prepared query-based. And so that would be like a SQL view or a Metabase cached model, which we'll talk about, where you sort of prepare the metadata ahead of time and you store that, but you don't actually get the data itself until the request for the data happens. And then another type of query-based data modeling is the push method. So this is where you would transform and store in ephemeral storage. Oh, sorry, I got that backwards. So SQL view, sorry, prepared would be like a SQL view. So you say like, this is what I might want sometime in the future. You describe it, that kind of thing. And that's also similar. I should write this. Metabase models. Sorry, it's my first time doing this presentation. It's new content, so I might make a few edits along the way. Yeah, so the prepared would be like you prepare the query ahead of time, you prepare the question in Metabase ahead of time, you save it as a model, or even a actually I'll add that too. Save questions. So those are all examples of sort of prepared data models, or they could be considered that way. Versus a push method is where you prepare it, but you also store the data. So you're not just storing the query, but you're also storing the data ahead of time. Usually that happens either based on a trigger or a schedule. And then there's also ETL data modeling. So this is separate from query-based, where it's usually or almost always pushing data, meaning you're doing something. Again, the ETL-based means it's outside of a database client, or driver in most cases. And you're actually preparing the data before the request using both transform and store phases. An example of this is like you might run a Python script. I mean, there's lots of different tools to do this that have been used over the time, but like PySpark is a really common one, that kind of thing. So we've kind of talked about what data modeling is, but we haven't really talked about like, how you use it, where you use it, that kind of thing. So data models are really building blocks when you're trying to get information from wherever its source is to whatever target or consumer you have. So there's different layers of that conceptually. So you can have the data source, database, data warehouse, data mart, or other secondary reporting database or schemas. You could have a data modeling tool. That could also be like an ETL tool, and a data target or consumer. So you sort of start and end always with a data source and data target and consumer. There's also some repeatability here. So like you could have a process or a data pipeline, as they're often called, that has a data source and its target is actually a data warehouse. And then that sort of data warehouse becomes a data source. And so it kind of repeats. You can skip some of these in the middle if you need to, but it always is going to have a data source and a data target or consumer. And data modeling can occur at any of these layers. And so with the modern tools and even older tools, a lot of times the tools might fit neatly or seem to fit neatly into one of these categories. Like Metabase would be a data target or consumer, since it's a database client. But most modern tools overlap a bit. So they're not purely doing acting as one of these things. A lot of times there's an overlap between this, and this, or this, and this. Sometimes like the database and data warehouse might be the exact same thing. You may not have one or the other, or you may have two different schemas inside it, that kind of thing. And so the modeling can happen at any of these layers, and it can happen in one of two places, on entry and on exit. So entry into storage or exit into storage. So that could even be in the same database. Like you could have something in a database that exits one table and goes into another table, and that's still kind of considered within that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about which layer to use and sort of the benefits and caveats of that. Like, why shouldn't you just run an ETL job to create models in your database? And in some cases you should. So I don't want to go too deep in that. I'm sure there might be some questions about it. Feel free to ask those and I'll get back to them in the Q&A. But generally speaking, at the data source level, you generally do not want to make any modeling changes there for a few reasons. The primary one being, if you've made a mistake, if your needs change, things like that, if you don't have the raw data sort of as is, like if you've altered the raw data or you didn't save the original, then it's going to be impossible or very difficult to recreate it, make changes, make adjustments and fixes. So it's usually a pretty bad idea to make data modeling or data transformations at the source level. It's usually better to take it up to a database layer, or even like in some cases like a data lake. That kind of putting that in the same category for the purposes of this. But somewhere where you can make changes, but always be able to go back to the original and have that available. And database layer, the utility of making changes there is that databases are really fast. They don't have charts and graphs. They don't have filters and click-throughs. Like, they're text-based. They're optimized for running queries and transformations very quickly. Not all types of transformations, but the most common ones, I would say, or some of the most common ones. Next is the data warehouse or data mart layer. So this would be either another database or a different schema in the same database. And the reasons you might want to make the transformations there is because it might be optimized differently. So the database might be something that is really sort of recording application data. It might be mostly raw data, versus your data warehouse or even a different schema in your database might be restructured or reformatted or added some indexes or things like that, so that you can really ask whatever questions or make whatever requests of that data that you need very quickly. And so that's kind of a benefit of doing it at that layer versus at the database layer. Although a lot of times, like, they are the same and they're just two different tables in like smaller data systems or ecosystems. There's also a modeling layer. And again, this is kind of including a lot of ETL tools. So that would be a layer between the consumer and the last sort of data storage. So I kind of mentioned that a lot of the tools overlap a little bit. So these two are primarily storage versus these two are primarily transformation, meaning here to here, I'm primarily storing. I might be making a few transformations, and what you can do transformation-wise is not advisable or not really very capable between those two. From here to here, you're kind of doing storage to storage with maybe some transformations in between to improve the usability of that secondary storage. From here to here, you're doing more significant transformations. This is really more about transformations more than storage. If there's transformations at this layer, it's usually put back into this layer or this layer. Like, so again, there might be a little bit of storage here, like caching or something, but it usually gets like kind of stored more permanently in one of these two layers if there are changes that need to be stored. And then on the last layer, and sometimes the modeling might be skipped if you're connecting directly to a data warehouse or something. But on the last layer, you're transforming the data from the last storage or the most recent storage to how it's going to be consumed. So that could be like Metabase, turning tables and ones and zeros into charts and graphs, or it could be formatting it for a specific upload, like EDI for data exchange between companies, that kind of stuff. So any of those I'd consider kind of a data consumer or a data target. And so this is really more about transformation. This is really more about storage. And they just sort of add different capabilities. So like data warehouses, you can do quite a bit more in most cases than you can with databases. Same for modeling, has kind of different data modeling tools like dbt and things like that have sort of different, or even Python scripts have a different capability set than your consumer side would. So benefits of using Metabase for data modeling. So one of the biggest ones is that you can really deliver the ability to model and reuse data and save your staff and users time by delivering those modeling capabilities closer to, those transformation capabilities closer to the end user. Sometimes you might deliver it directly to the end user. Sometimes it's a super user or an analyst or a data engineer or something like that, like a specialist that have a little more privileges than your most common users. And other times it's just Metabase administrators. That just depends on your scale, your staffing, things like that. But at these layers, you really need someone who's fairly technical. They usually need to know SQL or whatever query language you're using. At this level, there's some really nice tools available now that help with this, that make it a little more user-friendly. But most of the ones that are super user-friendly are not secure enough for sensitive data. So if you're dealing with any sort of sensitive data, you don't really want to use some of the ones that are kind of available and really easy to use. And like I'm thinking like Zapier, for instance. Like you could use Zapier as your modeling layer, using a Google Sheet or something as your database layer. But for a robust system, that's not really going to work for security reasons, for reliability, for a few different reasons, that kind of thing. So Metabase is kind of giving you a lot of that capability closer to the end user or for the end user, depending on the scenario. There's less technical knowledge. You don't need to know programming. If you do know SQL, there's a few more things you can do than if you don't know SQL. But you still, without knowing SQL, can do quite a lot. And we'll go through that in the demo. And just the user interface is a lot simpler. The user experience is a lot simpler. So the way Metabase handles data modeling is at the very bottom. So when data is ingested into Metabase, Metabase inspects the databases. It's called a sync and scan process. If you're a Metabase admin, you might be familiar with that. So when you first connect the database, Metabase sort of looks through all the tables, samples some data, and it puts together things like the foreign key relationships, like how two tables might be related, how they can be joined, the the semantic types, like is it a date, is it a location, is it a primary key, and also some formatting. So depending on your Metabase settings, it might kind of pick up the currency, and it might be formatting dates a specific way. It might be formatting dates, currency. It's a few other things that it can kind of pick up on. This isn't a comprehensive list. This is just kind of an example of a few things. And then there's 3 sort of ways to use that modeling, data modeling in Metabase. There's in the admin settings, there's table metadata where you can make universal changes. So if you update something in table metadata, any new content created after that update will incorporate those formatting changes or semantic changes or foreign key relationships, etc. Excuse me. One caveat is that if you've created content and then you go back and change table metadata, it doesn't propagate. So it's always a good idea to start when you first add a data source to take a look at that first. And I'll take a quick look at that when we go through this in the demo. Models is the second way to use data modeling in Metabase. So these are specific reusable changes. This is what we're going to spend the most time talking about. And this is really about, let's say you've got 2 fields that you use, could be revenue and quantity sold or something like that, to give kind of a simple example. And you always want to know the ratio between that. It could be revenue and cost of goods sold or something like that. It could be conversion rate. There's a lot of different things. We might want to have ratios. So that's a common example. It might be that you like reformat things, and every time you use the same data, you have to reformat it every time. So again, any of those changes that we talked about, like semantic, formatting, any of that kind of stuff, references, relationships in the data that you need to change, you can make those changes using data models in Metabase, and then build, instead of connecting directly to the table, you can build on that sort of authoritative source, and that way you're saving people time. They don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. But you can also help enforce consistency. So if you want people to use, a specific set of values, you can create a model, mark it as official if you have a pro version, and then that will allow you to sort of say, hey, if you're going to, ask questions about Zendesk data or something like that, start with the Zendesk model, and that way the data is already kind of cleaned up and prepped and ready to be used, and it's consistent with how other people in your organization are using it. Metabase also has segments and metrics, which kind of overlaps with this a bit, but the version we have in the product right now is fairly simple and doesn't do a lot of complex stuff. So we really kind of recommend focusing on the table metadata as kind of a base layer, and then models as the primary layer for any sort of like transformations, calculations, things like that that you find need to be used or reused a lot. Cool. So I'm just going to check if we have any pressing questions, and then we can jump into the demo. Okay, cool. I don't see any. All right, let me grab my notes here. All right, so if I wanted to, actually, let me start by just showing you for any admins, and sometimes admins, you can also give access to this for like a super user or something that shouldn't have full admin. So I'll just cover that quickly. In permissions, there's application permissions. And so the settings access here, sorry, I'm getting it wrong. Yeah, I believe it's a settings access, this one, that can allow a user to view table metadata and a couple other things, but you definitely want to check what they'd be able to view before you just add that access, because it doesn't just add table metadata, it adds several things without creating them as a full admin. So table metadata here, if I go to my sample database that comes with Metabase, so I just selected a database. If there were schemas, which I think I have something. Yeah, so if there were schemas, they would show up in this list here, click the schema, and then you'd see a list of tables. So going back to my sample database, if I click one of these tables, there's a couple things I could do. I could hide it if I just don't want it to show up anywhere in Metabase via self-service, that kind of thing. I'm not going to go into too much detail here because we're really going to focus on the models. But I just wanted to kind of show you there is some similarity of what you can do here and what you can do in models. And if there's something that you're not changing, you don't expect to ever change again, like a good example of this might be, so a tax or total amount. So here, I might want to change formatting and say, you know what, I want to use the like European style comma as a separator for the decimals and a period for the separator on the thousands. So like that's something you might universally, whenever somebody looks at this field, it needs to show up that way. So if you set that here, I mean, it'll propagate to any content created after you've changed the setting. So it's always a good idea when you add a data source to just kind of look through these. If you're not sure about something, just leave it as is. You can always go back and change it. But like if you're sure of something, it's something like that universal, then it's usually a good idea. Another thing that might come in is like sometimes you'll get numbers that are like in the hundreds of thousands, you know, in the hundreds of thousands or something, and or tenths of thousands or tenths of millions, and you want to add a multiplier. So there's a few things in there that might be helpful. You can also in here make some changes about how the filtering works on that field. And we'll talk about the field types when we go to models because it's very similar, if not the same. And you can also hide things here that you can't. You can hide things in models too, but you could hide things sort of universally here versus in models, you're only hiding it in that model. Cool. So let's just go ahead and create a model. So I'm going to click New Model. And there's two ways to create models. You can use the notebook editor or the native query. We're going to do the notebook editor first. So one cool thing about Metabase is you can actually create models from other models, from raw data, or from saved questions. So there's a variety of different places you can use to or reuse to build a model. Generally, I recommend building models off of raw data or only adding 1 or 2 layers of models. Things can get kind of complicated if you have like multiple layers of modeling, especially if there's a change in the underlying data. I'll talk about that a little bit later with like the best practices. But usually you're going to want to start with either a model or in most cases, start with raw data. So I'm going to select my sample database and I'm going to do, let's see, orders, and then I'm also going to join this to people. So one of the other cool things about models and most common use cases for them is that you know, maybe there's 2 tables that really don't make sense without each other, or you're always joining in columns from some table. Every time you use, you know, the orders table, you're always joining in some information from the people table. That's a really good use case for a model because you can create a model that has that join in it. You know, hide or adjust any columns. Like let's say, you know, I don't want most of this, but whenever I have an order, I always want to see the zip code of the person who made the order, and I always want to see the email address of the person who made the order. So like those 2 things might just be so relevant to the orders table that you need to, it's useful to create a model to include those. So then, and you can also, you know, make other changes, do anything you normally would with the Metabase query editor. Because I started by creating a model, or with the new model button, I kind of jumped into something that looks like the query notebook, but is a little bit different. If you see at the top, there's both query and the metadata tab. We'll talk about the metadata in a few minutes, but I just want to start with kind of building the query. So I'm just going to run this. Cool, looks good. I've got my zip code. I've got my email address. I'll go ahead and save this. I'm going to create a new collection. All right, and I'm going to call it orders plus people model, or actually, I mean, usually it's better to make a more like semantic name. So we'll call this orders with zip and email. Cool. So I've saved that, and what I have now is actually a question using that model as a data source. So if I click show editor, my data is not two tables joined to each other. It's now a model where I can select columns from that model. And so then you could, join this to other data. You could do anything you normally would here: filter, summarize, add a custom column, any of that kind of stuff. If I go back to this view, if I click the three dots here, I do have a couple new options. So one is I can edit the query definition. So that takes me back to the notebook editor to edit the model. So sometimes when people first start using this, they get a little confused because they click the editor here and they're like, well, where's my two tables I joined? I need to add a new column or something. So this now, when you're using a model, that shows up as edit query definition if you want to edit the actual model itself versus like making a new question or something based on the model. Another thing that shows up is the metadata. But before I get into that, actually, let me go back to creating a model. So I want to create a model again. This time we use a native query. I'm going to actually cheat a little bit because let's see where to put it. I'm just going to grab the SQL that's already in the model and just sort of reuse that. All right, so new model, native query, sample database, put in my SQL. This is where, I mean, you write whatever SQL you need to write. One caveat is with models, you cannot use variables or parameters. So models are sort of like Cartesian joins in a way. They don't have to be a Cartesian join, but they're sort of like a full data set that is unfiltered. And then if you wanted to add filters, you would create a new saved question based on that model, and you can add your variables and things like that there. So here I'm just going to get rid of the limit that Metabase automatically adds, and then just run it, make sure it works. It's great. And then I'm going to name this same, so orders with zip and email SQL. Cool. So same kind of deal, SQL-based model. If I go to the editor again, I start with that model or whatever the results of that model are. If I actually want to edit the model definition, I go back to edit query definition up here. And this is where I can actually edit that SQL again. Okay, let me see. One other thing I'll show you is you can actually create models from saved questions as well. So you can convert a saved question to a model, because maybe you already have lots of saved questions that people are reusing and or could reuse, and you want to start there. So if I just create new question, raw data, sample database, let me just do orders and products again. Maybe this time, or no, I did orders and people. So yeah, this is orders and products. So maybe this time what I really care about is the done with the ID, because that'll be duplicated. Maybe I really just care about like, maybe this is for accounts payable or purchasing or something. So like maybe I really just care about like the vendor. So like that. So this has, let's make a, cool. So I got my vendor here for the products and the orders. I'm gonna go ahead and save this. Call this orders with product, ordered, product, vendor. Put that in the same collection. Not going to add it to a dashboard. So now I've got a saved question. And by default, when you save models, they get pinned to the top of the collection. If you don't want them there, you can just unpin them. They'll show up in the list. They've got a slightly different icon, looks like a little cube. If you want to pin something there, you just pin it again like that. So here I'm going to click my orders with ordered product vendor, and then click my 3 dots. So this one, if I edit it, like it's still got my joins because it's not a model yet. But I can click the 3 dots and then turn into a model. And now click the editor. I'm starting with the model as a data source, or if I actually want to edit the definition, click the 3 dots and edit query definition. All right. Cool. So now is the fun part, or the kind of the meat and potatoes, or meat and beans and potatoes if you don't eat meat. So what is the purpose of doing a model other than just like making kind of a standardized data source? Well, one of the really cool things you can do with models is you can actually edit the metadata, similar to what we did with admin table metadata. But this is something that maybe it's more dynamic, maybe it's less consistent, maybe it's you want to make the change after you've calculated something and format the result of the calculation, like of a custom column or something like that. So that is where there's 2 ways, there's like 3 ways to get there. But you can either click edit metadata, takes you directly there. You can click edit query definition and then click the little metadata tab at the top. And then if you are viewing the collection with the model in it, you can also click the 3 dots next to the model. Oops, sorry. Click the model details next to the model. And then edit definition. And then same kind of deal, takes you to the same place. So yeah, the cool thing here is that I can click a column and change similar stuff to what I could change with the table metadata. So I could say that tax is actually a currency type. I could change the formatting of that to say this, I want it to say USD after it. I could change the decimal places, different things like that. So formatting changes, semantic type changes. This can be helpful, especially if you've written this complex SQL query and you want it to be used with sort of the Metabase automatic joining that can happen when you have 2 tables with a relationship between them. Metabase doesn't currently parse SQL, so it doesn't know how to read SQL. So here's a place where you could actually set like a foreign key and entity key relationship between your table that you wrote, this model you created with SQL, and a table that's in Metabase or another model, and actually have them automatically join or add the join conditions, things like that. Any of the categories you might use, like there's some special functionality for like locations relative to maps. The dates have a little bit of special functionality, that kind of thing. So if any of those are relevant, you can change those here. You can also incorporate some changes that you would make on a saved question. So if you want to display a link or display the value as a link or with just plain text, you can make that change here, referencing other columns, that kind of thing. And then you can also decide whether the column should show up only on the detail view or in any time you view it on table or detail view. Let me see if there's any that show up specific to, yeah, like date formatting. I think there's any others that are in this that might be relevant. Those are probably date formatting, number formatting, occasionally like, it's not a good example of that one. Yeah, I think that's probably the main thing is like text formatting, date formatting and number formatting. There's a few other, depending on the type that's selected here, there's a few other like formatting options that may be available. Let's see. So then, just gonna discard my changes here. So if you click the little eye icon, you can get a history of changes. So let's say I go to my query definition, and I also want to get category. Great, save changes. So you'll get the same sort of revision history here. It says, oh, the metadata was edited and the query was edited. You can also link to the model details. So here's where, again, you can edit the definition. If you click explore, it just starts a new question based on that model. One of the cool things about this is it'll also tell you where the model is used. And you can also examine the schema here or edit it. And then, oh, there's one other thing. If you have actions enabled on a database, you have to create a model to use actions. And so there'd be another button that would show up that would allow you to create actions on that. I'm not going to cover actions, but they sort of relate to models and are built on top of models. Actions are just ways to like create, read, update, or delete operations using Metabase. You can actually write back to the database if you have a use case to do that. Let's see. Cool. So then let me go to edit definition. Actually, let me start over. So I click one of these models. I can verify the model. So that's, I think, a pro feature, but that's something that could be helpful if, like, you might have a few different models you're working with, but then like somebody's actually figured out, hey, this is the one that everyone needs to be using. That's a good use case to like verify that model. What happens is it shows that it gets a little checkbox here. It shows up with the little checkbox next to it in the list. If it's not pinned, it shows, I think, the same. Yeah, it has a checkbox on this side as well as the cube with the checkbox. So a few different places to kind of indicate, hey, this is like official data, verified data. And if someone goes and changes that model, either intentionally or accidentally, it becomes unverified. So then if I went and changed the query, oh, this is wrong. Let me verify another one of these. Cool. So I've just verified that model. Now if I go back and say edit it, and actually I don't want category after all, save changes. So now it's unverified because it's been changed. So it's like a way to kind of know, like, oh, hey, the one we normally use now says unverified. That's a flag that maybe we need to go check if somebody changed it accidentally on purpose or whatnot. Cool. We kind of covered using a model. Like, I mean, it's just, if we create a new question here, we start with models and go to our tab there, and there's our 3 models. Create them as a data source, and then use them as a data source, and then just kind of build your questions from there. You can still join to other models or raw data or save questions as long as it's within the same database. And of course, it has to have some kind of field that it can join on. But basically, it's treated in Metabase like a table. Models are very much, if you're used to SQL, models are very much like Metabase's version of views in SQL. Model permissions are based on collection permissions. So who has access to view a model or you see a model depends on what collection it's saved in, and if they have view access or curate access to that collection. And then on top of that, the underlying data, if you have block access, that would prevent it from the data from being shown. But what some people do if they have data and they use models for most of their data is they might actually like create whatever collections they need to put the models for the data, and then they would actually disallow self-service permissions on the underlying tables. And that way it would kind of enforce users, especially if you have like non-admins or inexperienced users, sort of force them or encourage them to use models as a starting point, as opposed to going to raw data and maybe making a bad join or something like that, or calculating a value incorrectly, that kind of thing. And the last thing I'll cover is just model caching. So like I said, models are very similar to SQL views. They're just kind of Metabase's version of that. model caching is very similar to materialized views in SQL. So if you're familiar with materialized views, or if you're not familiar with materialized views, rather, they basically work by creating a query ahead of time, and then also saving the results either periodically on a schedule or based on a trigger. And so Metabase caching, model caching works based on a schedule. So I've enabled model caching. I've set the default to refresh the models every 6 hours. You could do a custom timeline. You could do, the different options available here. And then within a database, this is where you can enable like the model actions. And okay, so I've enabled this. Let me just go back to one of my models. Cool. I think I've covered everything I was going to cover on that. Let me see if there's something I missed. Oh yeah, I think that's it. I'm just going to do the best practices quickly, and then we should have about 10 minutes to address questions. So best practices, order of operations, start with admin table metadata first for any universal sort of data modeling, and then use the models next for the more variable data modeling or more complexity, or when you need to join 2 tables or 2 or more tables or anything like that. There's a couple caveats. So like there's a few changes you could make to the underlying data that would break content based on a model. One of those changes is changing the column type. So if you have a column called revenue and it's a string or like a variable, a text, and then you change that type to a numeric, then that it doesn't always, but it usually is going to break the dependent data. So this is another reason it's a good idea to sort of do that table metadata first, make sure everything is sort of the right format, the right type, etc., and then kind of build on top of that. And another one is like removing a column. So if you've got a saved question that's using columns A, B, and C, and that's coming from this model that has columns A, B, and C, and then you delete column C from the model, that's going to break that question because it's looking for column C and it's no longer there. Column additions are not automatically incorporated, meaning like if you in that example added column D, that saved question, let's say you got ABC and then questions ABC, and then you add column D to the model. If you go run that question again, it's going to only show you ABC because it doesn't know that the model has been updated. So then you can go and edit that question and say, okay, now I see in the model there's another one to check, and check that box. And then same, I think I mentioned this, but like changes in the admin table metadata don't propagate down to models. There's a few examples I think they do, but in most cases they don't. And so if you were to build models and save questions and a bunch of content, and then go back and change the table metadata, to change the currency format or something, that saved content has the currency format saved in it. So it's not going to propagate down those changes, but new content you create off of that data would have those changes. Yeah, so like tips for maintaining data integrity. A lot of that is really about like kind of top down and bottom up from the data source to the data consumer or target. So I kind of like to think about it in terms of that model, and whatever is relevant to your particular data infrastructure, ecosystem, whatever systems you use, you can kind of replace those in here where they fit. But I sort of think through like, okay, Metabase has a couple of layers within it. Beyond that, you might be using like dbt or something. Beyond that, Snowflake or something, or Redshift, and then beyond that, Postgres, or however your system is set up. But it's usually a good idea to go both directions. So thinking about like, where is this data potentially, having issues, having consistency problems, from the bottom layer to the top, and then from the top layer down. And then optimizing data models for performance. So model caching will help with that. So that sort of model caching, I should have mentioned this. Basically, you can create a separate, actually, let me just show you that. So I have Postgres. So here you can turn model caching off for a specific database. And then what happens is Metabase, I think it tells you this here. Yeah. So Metabase needs write access for model caching to the database, but it doesn't need write access to all the data. It only needs write access to a specific schema that it's going to create and use for caching. So what it does is on whatever schedule it's using, it runs that model, inserts those rows into a table in this schema that's dedicated to this model cache, and that's within the same database that you're caching, and so that gets basically saved into the database so that when Metabase queries that model, it's not rerunning some complex SQL question or some complex question again. It's running the result of that was saved on whatever schedule it was used. And then another strategy for optimizing is like moving things down in the layers. So like if you're doing something in Metabase with like, and I've seen this, it's not unheard of. I've seen like SQL questions that are like 1,000 lines long with like multiple case statements and joins and formatting and date conversions and all sorts of stuff, and like this huge and nested queries. For something like that, you can do it in Metabase, and people do. But I find it's much easier to maintain at like the database level, the data warehouse level, and a lot of people use like dbt for stuff like that. Sometimes you don't have that option. Sometimes you still prefer, Metabase or a different tool. That's totally fine. But in some cases, like performance-wise, like really complex SQL questions, like native SQL questions, it makes sense to move them to a lower layer where, for different reasons, they can be optimized a little bit differently. And I think that is it. So I will take a look at the questions here.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you very much. Just a little note before we jump into the question section, I just sent in the chat a link to our survey. Let me see, this is the correct one. Please let us know how did you like the event? Was it useful for you? This usually helps us to better build the future agendas. And we can jump to questions. If you have any more questions, please leave them in the chat. But otherwise, Jacob, please feel free to answer them.
Sure. Let me see. So our roadmap is, I think it's just, yeah, it's metabase.com/roadmap. I'll paste that in the chat. I don't remember what. Oh, that's right. We're going to do model-only permissions. So we're separating out model permissions in the next version from others so that you could say, hey, they can access this data, but only as models. Also, we're changing the data browser a little bit so that when you go to do like browse data, there next to it is also browse models. And so we're sort of making that a little easier to get to so you don't have to like drill down to find models. And then in future releases, we have some things planned like in the next year or so. But those are those are the changes that are coming in the next like major version. Or I don't know if it's 50 or 51, but it's one of those two. It's going to include both of those changes I mentioned, or one of them.
Jacob, if you could just read out loud the question so that people can follow.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. So that was in response to what new features are expected in the nearest releases related to modeling in Metabase. Creating a model from a saved question. What happens when the used saved question is modified or deleted? That would break the model. So if you build something on content that is significantly altered, it is likely to break that whatever you built on top of it. If you're just adding stuff to whatever's built underneath, that's usually fine. But if you're like removing columns, deleting it entirely, that kind of thing, it's usually going to break what's below it. Is the recommended best practice to create models or just have the database sync the tables? So both. So you want the database to sync the tables, and then if there are tables that very few people use as is, they're always joining stuff to it or changing the formatting or things like that, that's a good use case for a model. But you can use models with the raw data, with the tables. So in some cases, the table as is, perfectly great to use, keep using that. In other cases, it's better for a model because you need to join stuff or change it, transform it in some way. So there's not like a one right answer. It just depends on your situation, but both are totally fine. Can models with different underlying data sources join together? No. So if they have a different data connection, like if they have different tables or schemas, totally fine. But if the connection to the database is different, Metabase cannot connect across two different database connections. Is it a good or bad practice to build models based on a DB view? Metabase treats views in a database as if they're tables, and there's the tiniest of difference. It's like kind of technical in the background, but like for 99.9% of use cases, Metabase considers a view in a database and a table in a database to be the same thing or same type of thing. So there are good reasons to create views in your database and use that instead of tables. Some of those might be like you expect them to change a lot. So you might want to create a layer of separation where you can keep using the same view, but change all the underlying SQL, and Metabase's dependent content will continue to work no problem as long as the columns and column types stay the same, or you can add stuff but you can't remove, that kind of thing. But otherwise, there's no pro or con to using a view or a table as a basis for a model. About DBT, is it similar to models? It's similar in that you can use it to create reusable content, and you can use it to like build new tables essentially, or models in this case instead of tables, but in DBT would actually build tables or views. They're very different in implementation. One of them runs on top of your database and kind of goes SQL to SQL, versus Metabase like sits on top. So one of them is like going back and forth in the database or to a similar database or data warehouse. That's DBT. Metabase is sitting on top of all of that. So like DBT would operate in here. Metabase operates, Metabase models operate here. And if they're cached, they would cache back to a source. But DBT is actually going from DBT from these sources back to those sources, versus Metabase, and if it's not cached, is like staying in Metabase. When to use one or the other? So if you're doing really heavy lifting, like queries that take 10 minutes to run, 30 minutes to run, an hour to run, that's probably a DBT. Versus if it's a query that takes 5 minutes to run or an hour to run, like I'd say an hour or less, I would say it's Metabase. I mean, with the cached models, you can have something that takes 2 hours to run and use that with Metabase. But thinking more about like, is it taking that long to run because it's processing an enormous amount of data, versus is it taking that long because it's really complex? Those are kind of decision points. And another, it's actually, I should have said this first, but kind of thinking it through out loud, is the expertise of your team and like the technical resources you have available. I would definitely lean towards the expertise of your team and the resources you have available. If you don't have a lot of availability or of technical resources that can do DBT, it's definitely worth starting with the models and using that as a good place to figure out what the limits are for your data ecosystem, and then consider DBT if you don't have an obvious use case for it. Model caching in a multi-tenant environment. Okay, so model caching in a multi-tenant environment, will data be stored per user or globally? Data would be stored based on the data connection, meaning if you have one data connection and maybe like sandboxing on top of it or impersonation, then it's going to use the same schema for that entire database connection. So if the connection is multi-tenant, then the caching is multi-tenant. If you have one database connection per tenant, then you're going to have one model caching schema per tenant as well. So if the database connection is single tenant, then the model caching will be single tenant. Okay, you covered the governance question. So somebody asked, I'd love to see data governance using Metabase. And Margaret answered that we do have some events planned around that. Yeah.
Yeah, and we do have a recording. Actually, Jacob did a very great webinar last year on the best practices of organizing your Metabase instance. So you're welcome to check that out too. We have a recording of that. I think we covered all of the questions people had. And I think we're about time. So Jacob, thank you very much for running the webinar today, and thank you everyone who joined us. Please check out our events page. We do have many more events upcoming, so we will be happy to see you there too. And for today, I think that's going to be it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Margaret.
Thank you. Bye-bye.